Philip II of Spain entered the last stage of his life already infected by the disease that would consume him. The first symptoms appeared in 1578, when ulcers opened on his legs and refused to close. At first the court physicians treated them as gout or exhaustion, common among rulers who spent long hours seated. But the swelling worsened, and the skin began to split. Beneath the linen stockings, the flesh darkened and oozed a thin yellow liquid that smelled of metal. He dismissed it as a passing ailment and continued to work. Every day began at 4 in the morning. He rose for prayer, dictated letters, and examined reports from Flanders and the Indies. The ulcers bled under the table while he signed decrees. Servants discreetly changed the bandages during meetings. By 1579 the pain had reached a point where he could no longer kneel at Massachusetts. He ordered that services be held in his private chamber so that no one would see him limp. Refusing rest, he saw suffering as part of divine duty. When the doctors suggested fewer hours at his desk, he replied that a king's body belonged to God, not to medicine. By 1580 the infection had spread up to his knees. The physicians bled him, applied leeches, and washed the wounds with wine and vinegar. The smell filled the corridors of the Escorial, the massive palace monastery he had built to embody discipline and faith. He endured the treatments without complaint, quoting scripture while attendants scraped away necrotic flesh. The ulcers deepened, their edges turned black. The bandages stuck to the skin and tore it open each morning. The servants learned to move silently, to replace linens before visitors arrived, and to keep the room perfumed with incense to conceal the odor. Despite his condition, Philip insisted that all state business continue from his bedside. The council met there regularly. He received ambassadors sitting upright in his chair, his robes covering the swollen legs. He dictated orders to the New World and authorized military spending for the Netherlands. Those who entered the chamber later admitted that they avoided breathing deeply. The air was thick with a mix of rot and incense. Yet the king's authority remained absolute. Even half-conscious with fever, he corrected drafts and added notes in his precise handwriting. In 1581 and 1582 the disease became chronic. The ulcers no longer closed at all. Doctors recognized signs of gangrene. The pain forced him to sleep in short intervals, always sitting, because lying flat increased the pressure and made the wounds burst. He ordered the musicians dismissed, the corridors muffled, and the palace kept in silence. Only his confessor, his physicians, and a handful of servants were allowed near the bed. The empire that stretched across continents was now governed from a single room smelling of vinegar and flesh. Philip explained his condition as God's will. He told his confessor that the corruption of his body reflected the sins of the world. He saw himself as an instrument of atonement, chosen to suffer so that Spain would remain blessed. When the physicians begged to use stronger medicines, he refused, claiming that pain purified the soul. What they called infection, he called penance. The rot continued upward, but he prayed louder, convinced that divine strength would outlast moral weakness. By the mid-1580s his entire lower body was affected, yet his faith and control remained intact. The ulcers were drained daily, the blood mixed with vinegar until it turned brown. The sheets had to be changed twice a day. His attendants wore gloves soaked in camphor. The work, the rituals, the prayers, all continued without interruption. It was the beginning of a long deterioration that would last almost 2 decades, a process where the man, the flesh, and the empire would decay together. By the late 1580s, Philip II's condition had become impossible to disguise. The ulcers that had once covered only his legs had spread upward, eating into the flesh of his thighs. The physicians no longer spoke of recovery. Each morning began with the same procedure. The servants carried bowls of warm water mixed with vinegar, unwrapped the soaked bandages, and drained the pus that had collected during the night. The smell filled the chamber and seeped into the stone walls. The wounds were black at the edges, raw in the center, and so deep that the bone could sometimes be seen beneath the tissue. The king endured the cleaning in silence, clutching a crucifix while murmuring prayers. His voice never rose, even when the pain made him tremble. By 1587 he could no longer leave his bed. The Escorial, designed as a monument to order and faith, had turned into a sickroom. The windows were covered to block light that irritated his eyes, the air hung heavy with the scent of ointments and decay. Only a few attendants, physicians, and confessors were allowed to enter. Every sound was controlled. Servants were ordered to walk barefoot on the stone floors. Even the smallest noise was said to disturb the monarch's prayer. The once crowded court had vanished behind closed doors. Ministers submitted reports in writing. The empire was ruled through notes passed in and out of a darkened room. The doctors tried every known remedy. They bled him from the arm to balance the humors, applied heated knives to the edges of the ulcers, and placed leeches near the knees to draw the infection downward. Nothing worked. The rot advanced faster each month. The wounds leaked continuously, soaking through linen, and the fluid ran into the mattress. Each day the sheets were changed and the mattress turned, yet the smell remained. Flies gathered around the corners of the bed, and servants brushed them away with fans made of feathers. One physician recorded that the discharge had the color and stench of corruption. Philip accepted the suffering as divine punishment. He insisted that it was his duty to endure without complaint. He told his confessor that kings were chosen to suffer on behalf of their people and that his own corruption was a form of redemption. He refused opiates or sleep draughts, claiming that pain was proof of grace. Even as fever blurred his vision, he continued to dictate letters and approve documents. The scribes worked from the far side of the room to avoid the odor. The king's hand shook when he signed, but he refused to let another do it for him. Every decree still bore his mark, though sometimes the ink was mixed with drops of blood from his trembling fingers. Outside the bedchamber, Spain's power appeared untouched. Fleets still sailed from Seville, silver still arrived from the New World, wars still continued in the Netherlands. Yet within the palace, reality was different. The empire was being managed by secretaries and relatives, while its ruler lay motionless, wrapped in stained sheets. The Escorial had become a place of ritual and infection. Candles burned day and night, the walls darkened by soot, the air thick with the mix of incense and rot. Those who entered spoke later of the silence, not peaceful, but heavy and unnatural, broken only by the wet sound of cloth being lifted from the wounds. By 1589, the physicians recognized the onset of gangrene. The flesh around the ulcers turned gray, and the skin began to separate from the bone. They tried to cauterize the edges with hot iron. The pain was unbearable, but Philip endured it without a sound. The treatment failed. The infection spread to his groin and lower back. His body temperature swung violently between chills and fever. When delirium came, he spoke of angels and battles, insisting that the rot in his body mirrored the rot of sin in the world. His confessor recorded that he often begged God not for life but for endurance. The chamber had become a symbol of Spain itself, vast, powerful, and trapped in its own ritual. The attendants carried on their routines with military precision: bandages at dawn, drainage after noon, prayers at night. The same actions repeated every day, as if repetition alone could hold back death. The courtiers outside spoke of the king's holiness, but those inside saw the truth: a man dissolving alive. The physicians no longer believed he would recover, they only tried to slow the decay. By 1590, Philip's body had become unrecognizable. The legs were swollen, purple, and covered in open sores that no longer bled but oozed continuously. The fever left him half-conscious for hours. When awake, he still asked for state papers and insisted on reading them. The empire continued to move on his signature, though the man himself was no longer whole. The chamber of rot had become his entire world, a sealed space where prayer, medicine, and decay merged into one. The most powerful ruler of his age now governed from a bed that smelled of death, his mind still sharp inside a body that was already decomposing. By the early 1590s, Philip II's illness had moved beyond medicine. The physicians no longer spoke of healing, their role was to keep the body intact for as long as possible. The gangrene that had begun in his legs had spread toward the hips, and the constant fever blurred his sight and mind. yet he still viewed his suffering as divine duty. Confession became his only form of conversation. He spent hours each day in prayer, whispering scripture while attendants cleaned the wounds that no longer responded to treatment. The smell of rot filled the chamber despite the constant burning of incense. For those who served him, the act of entering the room was a test of endurance. By 1591 he could no longer move without assistance. The ulcers had turned black and dry at the edges, and new ones opened on his back from lying still. Each day, the physicians drained the pus and washed the sores with vinegar and wine. They kept bowls of leeches beside the bed, though the king's blood had thickened so much that the leeches often fell off before feeding. His skin had taken a yellow tone, stretched tight over bone. His appetite was gone. He survived on broth and small pieces of bread soaked in wine. When he could no longer hold a spoon, a servant fed him with a silver cup. Faith became his only strength. He told his confessor that every wound was a blessing, every spasm a sign of grace. He repeated that God had chosen him to suffer in place of Spain, that through his pain the empire would remain pure. The priests encouraged this belief. They spoke of purification and martyrdom, and the king listened with closed eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. His chamber became both chapel and hospital. Crosses hung over the bed, relics lined the shelves, and bowls of medicine stood beside the crucifix. The line between faith and disease disappeared. The fever grew stronger each month. At night, he often slipped into delirium, calling the names of long-dead relatives, believing he was standing before God's throne. Servants described hearing him argue with invisible voices, asking whether his body had rotted enough to earn forgiveness. Sometimes he ordered that the wounds not be cleaned, claiming that pain should not be interrupted. Other times he demanded more vinegar, shouting that the smell of corruption was proof that the devil had been driven out. His faith had become an obsession, his body the altar on which he sacrificed himself. By 1593 the court around him had changed. Ministers worked outside the Escorial, passing decisions through messengers. The palace, once filled with ceremony, had turned into a place of whispers and isolation. The king's orders were still obeyed, but the empire was now ruled by secretaries. Inside the chamber, the daily routine remained unchanged: cleansing at dawn, prayers at noon, and drainage of the ulcers at night. The king insisted on witnessing every step. Even half-conscious, he murmured prayers while the surgeons scraped away dead tissue. They worked by candlelight, careful not to look him in the eyes. His confessor later wrote that Philip no longer feared death but feared interruption, that he might die before his purification was complete. He saw the body as something to be burned away until only faith remained. The physicians tried to hide their despair. They had begun to notice the infection spreading beyond the flesh. The smell alone told them that the rot had reached the bloodstream. Yet the king's mind, though clouded by fever, still clung to control. He ordered the council to meet near his room so that he could hear the voices of his ministers, proof that the empire continued to obey. By 1594 he was scarcely recognizable. His hair had thinned, his face was hollow, his voice little more than a whisper. The skin around the wounds had turned gray and leathery, and the bandages bled through before noon. He asked for the crucifix to be tied to his hands so that it would not slip when he lost consciousness. Those who saw him said that the body no longer looked alive but did not yet seem dead, a shell that moved and spoke through will alone. The faith that had once given Spain its unity now consumed its king. He believed he was keeping the empire alive through his own decay, that his rotting flesh was the price of divine favor. Each day he demanded to know if the wounds had changed, as if their shape could reveal God's decision. By 1595, he had turned completely inward. The man who had commanded armies and governed continents now ruled only the space around his bed. Faith and flesh had become the same thing, both breaking down, both feeding on each other, both slowly disappearing. By 1596, Philip II was no longer a man but an object of endurance. His body had lost almost all movement. The legs were black and swollen, the skin splitting under the pressure of accumulated fluid. The gangrene had spread upward through the hips and abdomen, and the pain had become constant. The physicians could only open the sores to release the pus, clean them with vinegar, and rewrap the limbs. The same process repeated day after day, but the infection had already reached the bloodstream. His pulse was weak and irregular, his breathing shallow, his body cold even under blankets. The attendants described the smell as unbearable. One wrote that the king's chamber could be recognized from the opposite end of the corridor by the odor alone. He no longer left the bed at all. The Escorial had turned into a mausoleum. The curtains remained closed, the air stagnant. The priests who attended him came and went in silence, holding their sleeves to their faces. Each morning the servants changed the sheets, which were always stained by the same yellow and brown marks. The mattress was replaced twice a week because the fluid soaked through every layer. The king's body had become the center of the empire, not its mind or soul, but its rotting core, commanding attention through horror rather than power. His will to govern, however, persisted. He still requested reports from Madrid, still gave orders, still signed decrees when his hand allowed it. Ministers entered quietly, bowed, and waited as he slowly pressed his trembling signature onto the paper. His voice was reduced to a whisper, but the authority in it had not disappeared. He refused to delegate final approval of state matters. The documents that left his room carried the faint smell of vinegar, and courtiers often said that the odor of decay now marked the business of Spain itself. By 1597 the fever had grown constant. He drifted in and out of consciousness, often confusing dreams with reality. The confessor wrote that the king spoke to invisible figures, addressing them as saints, generals, or long-dead relatives. At times he tried to rise from bed to give orders, believing that battles were being fought outside his door. The attendants restrained him gently and lowered him back into the sheets. When he awoke, he apologized, saying that pain blurred his judgment. The boundaries between his faith, his rule, and his agony had collapsed completely. The physicians now discussed amputation, but it was impossible. The infection was too advanced, and the king's strength too low to survive the procedure. Instead, they lanced the sores daily and poured wine into them to draw out the stench. The pain made him tremble uncontrollably, yet he still refused any sedative. He repeated that his body was a tool of God's justice and must be allowed to suffer. His confessor, terrified by the sight, tried to persuade him to accept relief, but the king refused again. "If I stop feeling," he whispered, "I stop ruling." The court around him had changed beyond recognition. Foreign ambassadors were received only by secretaries. No one outside his chamber had seen him for months. Rumors spread across Europe about the condition of the Spanish monarch. Some said his body had begun to rot while his heart still beat. Others claimed that his attendants used perfumes and spices to delay visible decomposition. Inside the palace, the truth was worse than rumor. The smell of corruption hung in every corridor. Servants burned herbs continuously, but nothing could mask it. By the summer of 1598, death was clearly approaching. The wounds had stopped draining, the skin around them had turned dry and gray. The physicians said the blood no longer circulated properly. His lips were cracked, his tongue swollen, and he could barely swallow. He continued to receive communion daily, often coughing blood after it. His voice was faint, his words few. The empire was now ruled entirely by his ministers, yet every decision still required his name. The last signature he placed on a royal decree was made with a hand so weak that the ink barely marked the page. When the fever reached its final peak, he lay motionless for hours, whispering prayers between shallow breaths. The attendants wiped his mouth and kept a crucifix tied to his hand. He asked that the curtains remain closed so no one would see him die. His final days passed in near silence, only the sound of dripping oil from the candles and the faint hum of flies near the bed. Those who witnessed it later wrote that it was not a man dying but a body being emptied of what was left of life. By September 1598, Philip II, the ruler of the largest empire in the world, had become what his servants quietly called him, a living corpse. His mind had outlasted his body, but not for long. The decay that had begun 2 decades earlier had reached its end. When he finally died, those in the room said it was hard to tell the exact moment, because the body had looked dead for so long. When Philip II finally died in September 1598, his attendants said the room barely changed. The air was already thick with the smell of decay, and the body had long since resembled a corpse. His death was quiet, without movement or struggle, witnessed only by priests and physicians who could no longer tell where disease ended and death began. The confession was whispered, the final prayers recited over a face already pale and hollow. The same hands that had dressed his wounds for years now prepared the body for burial. They washed the skin with wine, packed the ulcers with herbs, and wrapped the legs in clean linen. The fluids continued to seep through even after the heart had stopped. The embalming began immediately. The royal physicians opened the chest and abdomen to remove the organs, which had already begun to liquefy. The smell filled the chamber and spread through the corridors of the Escorial. Incense and candles could not hide it. The inner walls of the coffin were lined with aromatic cloths, but nothing could stop the stench of infection. The face was coated with a mixture of wax and oils to preserve the shape, though witnesses wrote that the features had already collapsed. The mouth could not be closed, and the skin around the eyes had turned gray. Outside the chamber, the palace remained silent. The courtiers, who had lived for years under the shadow of the king's illness, moved slowly, unsure whether to mourn or to feel relief. The man who had ruled them had turned suffering into a form of government. Now, even in death, he continued to dominate their days. The body was dressed in royal robes, the hands clasped around a crucifix, and the coffin was placed in the chapel for viewing. The smell forced the priests to shorten the vigils. The candles burned constantly, and the wax mixed with the odor of decay until the entire chapel smelled like a tomb that had never been sealed. When the procession to Madrid began, the journey moved slowly. The coffin was carried under heavy cloth to prevent the public from seeing what the decay had done. Soldiers and monks walked beside it, chanting prayers. The heat of the late summer made the odor unbearable. People along the route fainted as the wind shifted, carrying the stench toward the crowds. The Spanish Empire, which had once stretched across oceans, was now symbolized by the body of its king, decomposing in its own splendor. The burial at the Escorial was performed with all possible ceremony. Trumpets played softly, choirs sang hymns, and ministers stood in silence as the coffin was lowered into the crypt. Yet those who attended wrote that the smell of rot was still present, rising through the incense like a final reminder that no power could escape corruption. The walls of the monastery that had witnessed his long agony now became his grave. The same bed that had held his body during life stood only a few rooms away from the tomb that now held it in death. In the months that followed, rumors spread across Europe. Some said that when the coffin was opened later for inspection, the body had not fully decomposed, others said it had turned black and liquid within days. Whatever the truth, the story of his death became a reflection of his reign. The empire he left behind was still vast but already rotting from within, bankrupt, exhausted, and governed by officials who had learned more from ritual than from reason. The monarchy continued, but the idea of divine perfection that had shaped Philip's life had died with him. The Escorial remained his monument, a structure of stone, silence, and death. Those who entered its halls in the years after his passing described an atmosphere that still carried the scent of illness and incense. His bed, his crucifix, and his bandages were preserved as relics. For Spain, the funeral never truly ended. The king's body had been buried, but the image of his suffering continued to define the nation he had ruled. The empire that had once seemed eternal now mirrored the fate of its master, majestic on the surface, hollow underneath, and slowly collapsing under the weight of its own decay.